The theory of evolution by natural selection, formulated in Charles Darwin's book On the Origin of Species in 1859, is the process by which organisms change over time as a result in changes in heritable, physical, or behavioral traits. Changes that allow an organism to better adapt to its environment, will help it survive, and have more offspring that will pass on the successful genes. Every organism living today has special adaptations that were developed through the process of evolution, helping certain species thrive in their given environment. Birds are no exception to this caveat. While less susceptible to the same extinction threats that non-flying animals are, birds are becoming more and more threatened each year. The cause of these threats? Humanity and environmental changes. The reason, however, that these threats influence the species so negatively is evolution itself. You see, through evolution and unique adaptations, these bird species were able to escape extinction for the past hundreds of thousands of years. But now, due to man's constantly developing world, the same adaptations that were essential in helping species thrive for so long could be the same things that lead to their extinction. Diet and hunting techniques are adaptations that birds have developed over hundreds of thousands of years that directly influence the survival of their species. Specializations related to what a bird can eat, along with how they go about obtaining their food, are both things that cannot change quick enough with our ever-developing world. It is common knowledge that food is essential for survival as an individual and a species as a whole. While as far as humanity is concerned, food can take millions of different shapes and sizes, food for wild bird species is much more rudimentary and can be categorized into what I like to call prey or plant. In this simplified categorization, there are several subfields, some of which being insects, meat, fish, berries, and nuts. Based on the vulnerability of species who rely on specific food sources in these subfields, a conclusion can be drawn onto how likely a species is to go extinct. This information may be helpful in being proactive in helping species extinction, if it's not already too late. To learn more about the subject, I sat down with curator of birds at the Delaware Museum of Natural History and ornithologist Dr. Jean Woods.
I'm Dr. Jean Woods. I'm the curator of birds at the Delaware Museum of Natural History. Birds can be very specialized on certain types of food. If that food is very common, they can still be specialized and there's no problem. Like the herons, most of the herons are very specialized in eating only fish. As long as there's a lot of fish around, and there still are, then there's no problem. A bird can be specialized in eating mosquitoes. There's no shortage of mosquitoes. But in general, the more specialized the diet that a bird has, the more potential there is for something to go wrong with the food source. And if they can't switch to an alternate food source, then that's going to be a negative impact on them. One of the birds that we are very concerned about in Delaware is the red knot, and they have this really unique feeding adaptation where during their migration they stop in Delaware Bay and they feed on the eggs of horseshoe crabs. Well, horseshoe crabs started being used increasingly as a bait for fishing, and their numbers went down, and so then the red knots were sort of so specialized on this food source that they couldn't switch to another food source, and so their numbers went down as well because of the decreasing horseshoe crabs. Some birds, by nature of their evolutionary history, are more flexible in terms of habitats they're using, and so they have just sort of because of this history, have a better ability to move into human modified habitats and get along well. And again, birds with generalized diet, because of their evolutionary history, that's the evolutionary track they're on, again, are able, if one of their food supplies disappears, they're fine because they have multiple alternatives, or are able to use a food supply that has come into, been brought in by humans.
Common North American birds that you may see in your yard or local park hunting for small insects, munching on seeds, and picking away at berries are mainly referred to as backyard birds. These birds have been able to aptly adapt to live alongside us with the help of an invention of ours. Needing little space to nest and being somewhat generalized in what they eat, these birds can be seasonal visitors or residents depending on where you live and what plants are around you. While their primary plant-based diets restrict some birds to foods such as nuts, berries, seeds, and grass, some species can also eat insects. While this may only seem like a slight difference in diet, it makes a huge difference when judging species based on their diet. The more varied and generalized a diet can be, the more likely a species is to survive if given any changes in the environment. Common birds you may see in your neighborhood searching for food include the northern mockingbird, tufted titmouse, and house finches, just to name a few. While a majority of backyard birds dabble in both plant and bug diets depending on what is around, some birds will purposely nest and live in areas with a surplus of nearby plant life and eat insects if they absolutely need to. Food for these birds comes naturally in the form of seeds from plants like sunflowers and wildflowers that grow in overgrown fields and farmland that is left untouched by people. These flowers that will bloom in spring and mature in summer are vital food sources for these birds, especially ones that are mostly non-migratory and have to build up food for the winter to stay warm. Plants as small as dandelions and as skinny as tall grass can provide some subsistence for birds, but a single dandelion patch can't hold down a family of finches for an entire season. They need more, just like every other species. This is where a man-made concept helps sustain species that would otherwise be troubled in finding food. For example, a common backyard bird like a northern cardinal could run into a problem when searching for seeds or plants to eat in an area short on such foods. This could be due to deforestation or invasive plants taking over the area. A problem nonetheless leaves a northern cardinal with the choice to try and keep searching in the same general area for food that may not be there, or fly to an area with a surplus of food, but also a surplus of birds, leading to heavy competition. This common problem leads to the cardinal, among other similar birds, adapting to feeding from man-made bird feeders. In these feeders, birds can find much-needed food. Foods like black oil sunflower seeds, striped sunflower seeds, assorted mixed seeds, and suit cakes. Thrown about in public places and backyards, small backyard birds, songbirds, and the occasional woodpecker may use these feeders as a significant source of food. They will return to the same feeder as often as necessary, with the only thing stopping them being competing birds and empty feeders. The birds that eat berries as well, though, can not so much rely on bird feeders as a solution for their food shortage problem, but instead they depend on certain berry-yielding bushes and trees to be planted around wooded areas. Berries such as viburnum opulus berries, elderberries, and chokeberries are examples of some of the ones most commonly consumed by birds. Just like the seeds being important for birds building up mass for the colder months, berries work the same way. The same issues arise from the plants that grow the berries not being plentiful enough in areas of deforestation or taken over by housing developments. These plants can be planted in yards alongside buildings, leaving some room for coexistence for both the developing world and these berry plants. Insects are a crucial part of some birds' diets, being their primary food source. Birds like flycatchers and swallows, who will catch their prey mid-flight in a showing of acrobatics, are hurt severely by insecticides. Some other birds will hop along tree branches and forest floors looking for any ant or caterpillar they can get their talons on. With beaks powerful enough to rip any beetle in half, or wings fast enough to catch any fly mid-air, birds are one of the insect's biggest predators. The other huge threat is the before-mentioned insecticides. A societal disdain of insects causes people to douse plants around their homes and public places with insecticides that get absorbed into the plants and inevitably eaten by the birds. While the chemicals used now are not as seemingly harmful as DDT was when it was used in the 50s and 60s, proper time has not passed long enough for conclusive research to be done establishing whether or not these chemicals used now are going to negatively affect generations to come. Alongside potentially negatively impacting the birds through chemical sprays, the insecticides also do their job pretty well in getting rid of insects. While this may seem like a benefit to humans, the result is a missing food group for the birds. Many birds depend on insects as a significant source of food and nutrition, some birds primarily only eating insects. If native plants go without insects, that takes an entire food group option away from some birds, leaving them only to eat fruits and seeds as a result, which birds may not be able to adapt quick enough to. A bird family affected by this potential lack of insects are the woodpeckers. Woodpeckers are more commonly heard than seen in dense woods and forests throughout North America. Ravaging bug-infested trees with their bills and repetitive pecking and drilling techniques, they can burrow their beaks far enough into tree bark to grab out anything from bees to beetles. Since these birds have not adapted to rely on berries and seeds, they are stuck with feeding on insects that live in dense forests or mature trees. One slight alternative that benefits some woodpeckers like the downy and hairy woodpecker is a thing called suit cakes that people can put in their bird feeder cages. Unlike normal bird seeds, these cakes are blocks made from soot and a thick substance mixed with other ingredients such as cornmeal, peanuts, fruits, and dried up insects. Flying from one tree to the next, woodpeckers have adapted to having strong talons that they use to cling vertically onto the side of trees, searching for insects, as well as tough beaks used to penetrate bark with. Being that the woodpecker depends heavily on mature woodlands and trees as a main food source, it is crucial that these trees are kept alive. Deforestation negatively affects their nesting, and even more so their feeding. While these bird feeders with custom suit cakes or insects are a possible solution for these woodpeckers that may not have a habitat to thrive in, they certainly cannot be dependent on enough to support generations of birds. Their parallel evolution with dense forests and the insects inside them is just as connected as the deforestation of their habitat is to their extinction. There is a feeding technique and diet that is an interesting one to watch, but a hard one to capture. Possibly the most acrobatic of the hunting birds. These birds are similar to flycatchers, but focus their energy in catching what is below the water instead of in the air. These birds are called terns. They can be found along marshes, bays, and ocean coasts, methodically flying in circles or lines, repeatedly diving into the water, attempting to catch small fish relatively close to the surface. Sometimes even diving underwater, they will attempt to catch a small fish no larger than the size of their beak, then fly off with whatever they have. If they miss, they will continuously fly back around and try again at the same school of fish until successful or tired. They will usually feed in groups and can be seen taking turns diving into schools of fish for hours on end. Due to their size, they are forced to settle for smaller fish opposed to large fish like an osprey or an eagle might get. This means the fish that they have adapted to eat are either not fully mature yet or small in nature, and sticking together in a school. Due to their restriction to smaller fish, they have to stick around hunting in certain areas for hours on end instead of being able to just grab one sole fish from any waterway. This leads to overcrowding in some places, with a shortage of fish and longer hunting endeavors that may still come up empty. Amongst competing with other terns and large fish, these birds also compete with humans. The smaller fish that they eat are commonly used as bait for bigger fish on fishing boats. Being that terns have evolved to nest coastally on dunes untouched by humanity, this also becomes an issue for the divers. With the mostly fish diet and their hunting technique being hardwired into their DNA, they have to nest close to the ocean to be close enough to acquire enough food to survive and be able to fly back home. With global warming causing sea level rises, miles and miles of sand and beaches being washed away each year by storms, and overused by humanity, the terns are losing more and more precious land that they need to be able to nest and thrive. Lurking around in shallow waterways and marshes is a long-legged stalker. They eat fish, crustaceans, insects, amphibians, and some even eat small reptiles, mammals, and other birds. Coming in all shapes and sizes are the wading birds, like this great egret hunting on the water's edge in a marsh. Some other wading birds include the snowy egret and the most famous one, the great blue heron. Wading is an action of walking through water or another liquid. These birds do this using their long skinny legs that are adapted to slowly creep around waterways, going seemingly unnoticed by their prey. They will slowly stalk around an area, and once a prey is seen underwater or on the ground, they will quickly shoot forward their necks, spearing their prey with their beaks or simply catching them. While these birds can visit small neighborhood ponds and streams, their main habitats are lakes, marshes, and rivers. Excluding the yellow night heron, the wading birds can eat a plethora of different things. Out of all the birds under the metaphorical microscope, the wading birds are the most adaptable to any change in food supply due to the amount of things that they can actually hunt and eat. As mentioned before, some herons and egrets can eat fish, crustaceans, amphibians, small mammals, reptiles, and sometimes even smaller birds. The majority of their diet being fish and aquatic animal species, however. With a mainly aquatic diet, this leaves one of their potential weaknesses being any possible contaminants transferring from the food like fish to the bird itself. Other than that, the long legs they use to be able to wade through shallow waters may backfire when sea levels begin to rise, and those shallow waters or mudflats they fed on turn into water too deep for them to hunt on. The ideal water height for a large wading bird is around 28 to 40 centimeters, and for the smaller birds is even less. So if the sea levels rise too much, the marshes currently used by wading birds to hunt would be underwater. With constantly shrinking habitat for these birds, competition can spur up at feeding ground, and the same birds that fed with each other previously can soon turn on each other. As generalized as birds like herons and egrets may be when it comes to feeding on natural food, there are some birds that scavenge for food and commonly eat human food as well. The most well-known example of which, especially near coastal areas, is the seagull. Seen doing anything from combing sandy beaches for crustaceans to snacking on sour cream and onion chips at a mall parking lot, these birds have adapted well to living alongside humans and developing areas. Their stereotype-like association with fries at the beach is not just an old wives' tale. Seagulls such as laughing gulls and herring gulls eat natural foods like crustaceans, fish, and mollusks. But they are also heavy consumers of practically any man-made food that they can find on the ground or in the trash. Just like eating too much bad food can kill a person, the same goes for the birds. While not good for the seagulls, the surplus of fatty man-made foods does not seem to have a large impact on species longevity yet. Seagulls are not the only bird that scavenge for their food and sometimes dabble in human delicacies though. Crows have also been studied to be digging through trash for food, feeding at landfills, and eating man-made foods just like seagulls do. These feeding habits lead to aggression towards both humans and competing bird species. Neither of those ever causes mass numbers of birds to be killed or die though. The major threat with this diet and scavenging techniques is the bird's inability to differentiate food from waste. Scattered on popular beaches and public areas that birds scavenge at are small plastic items, cigarette butts, and a lot more harmful stuff that can choke or kill the birds. This has more effect at the individual level, but affects species survival nonetheless. Another scavenging bird has a diet somewhat even more outlandish than eating leftover trash food. Vultures are some of the few birds that can eat carrion. Carrion is dead flesh from an animal. Say a rabbit decides to cross the road and they meet their unfortunate demise at the hand of an SUV. Spotting or smelling their carcass on the side of the road, vultures like the turkey vulture will fly around in circles until eventually coming down to snack on the dead animal. They have evolved to have extremely strong stomach acids to burn off bacteria from the rotting flesh and are essentially featherless from the neck up to avoid getting blood glued to them. While it may seem like they have a dependency on humans producing roadkill for them, there is evidence to suggest that they successfully thrive in areas where there are little to no roadkill produced. So as long as animals continue to successfully breed and die off, vultures don't have much to worry about in regards of evolutionary kickback. The only downside is they, in most cases, exclusively eat dead flesh, so if they cannot find carcasses, then they will obviously starve to death. Osprey are birds that live exclusively on coastlines, sometimes right on the water. Their natural nesting habitats are coastal trees, marshes, and beaches. Due to sharp declines in their desired habitat used for nesting, they have adapted to nesting in abandoned pillars, piers, and man-made nesting posts. They have to remain close to the water's edge on a coastline due to their dietary restrictions. You see, 90% of the given osprey's diet is made up of fish. What the osprey will do when hunting is fly over a water surface like, say, the ocean, and when a fish is spotted right under the surface of the water, it will quickly dive down, snag it out of the water with their razor-sharp talons, and either bring it back to the nest or feed on it right there. This diet leaves little room for adaptation to constantly developing and disappearing coastlines. Constantly competing with fishermen, areas that are overfished see a severe decrease and almost eradication of thriving osprey groups. Much like wading birds and shorebirds, they are heavily impacted by rising sea levels and violent storms causing habitat destruction to their feeding and nesting grounds. Zooming across sandy beaches on coastlines, shorebirds are relatively small birds who comb beaches picking away at small prey for subsistence. Due to some shorebirds migrating all the way from the Arctic down to South America and back, it is essential that these food groups for these birds stays intact and stable. They have diets that change seasonally with their migration. In some species' breeding seasons, they depend heavily on mostly insect diets. Stopping on beaches in the Delaware Bay in the late spring during their lengthy migrations, these small birds will fill up on horseshoe crab eggs for much needed energy. Other than that, they will feed on aquatic and terrestrial invertebrates. On coastal marine beaches, they will consume small crustaceans, mollusks, small worms, and biofilm, which is nutritious slime on sand. Due to their constantly changing diets, they need for a surplus of their desired food source to be ready and available during migration. If insects mature too quickly due to global warming causing early summers in northern breeding grounds, then there will be a mismatch that could be catastrophic for the birds. The same goes for horseshoe crab populations. There has since been bans and restrictions on their capture and bait use around the Delaware Bay when their importance to shorebirds was discovered. Due to their survival being built up on not just a surplus of food being available, but also timing staying consistent, and these habitats that they feed at needing to stay free of human activity, they are at very high risk for extinction. While their numbers are seemingly plentiful now, they are not as high as they once were decades ago. Since their conditions for survival are so fragile, if one single element of their current diet goes away, then many shorebirds would be unable to efficiently adapt and not make it through their migration cycle to breed. Calling swamps and marshes their homes, these smaller wading birds that cling onto tree branches when hunting are referred to as green herons. Much smaller than the great blue heron, but just as feisty. This species will cling onto fallen tree branches when hunting over shallow water without ever actually going in, and peck at fish and amphibians just like a normal wading bird would. But sometimes this tactic isn't always successful. Finally, after wasting energy pecking away at the water, green herons will do something very rarely seen in bird species. They will use feathers, twigs, leaves, and grass as bait to lure in fish and other prey. Seen here, the heron puffs out its own feather and places it in the water in hopes of attracting a fish, then replacing it close by when it starts to drift away. While this is always not as successful either, it shows how some bird species are able to change their hunting techniques to thrive in changing environments. Taking every factor of bird diet types and hunting techniques into consideration, the most fragile of which are the shorebirds. Due to the nature of their long migrations and dependence on certain food groups and items during said migrations, these birds are extremely vulnerable to change. The red knot, being the poster child for how quickly things can take a turn for the worse, has seen a population decline from about 82,000 individuals in the 1980s to fewer than 30,000 in 2010. They aren't alone in their plight, however, with sanderlings, sandpipers, and ruddy turnstones also seeing number decreases directly related to the overfishing of horseshoe crabs and environmental changes. Separated from the shorebirds by a half mile in regards of vulnerability to extinction would have to be birds like the osprey. Having to deal with the same negative effect bald eagles did when it comes to chemicals like DDT, these birds are still losing more and more habitat they need to nest on to stay close to their food sources. Having a diet made up of exclusively fish for the most part leaves the ospreys with little room to adapt for a constantly disappearing coastline that may not support their dietary restrictions for long, especially in water locations with high fish toxicity. If they can successfully convert to nesting on man-made structures that can continuously be built to sustain future populations, they still have hope. Terns would be the next vulnerable, primarily due to their nesting grounds being the largest concern for their longevity as a species. However, with only diet and hunting technique taken into consideration, they are not at a higher risk of extinction due to their diet unless, like the osprey's case, the fish become too contaminated to eat. The next bird family that would be at noticeable risk due to their one-dimensional living necessities would be the woodpeckers. With woodpeckers needing forests, trees, and a primarily bug-based food source, they are not currently in danger, but have one of the highest potentials to be. The United States lost an average of 949,750 acres of forest each year between 1990 and 2010 alone. This is a negative trend for both wildlife and specifically the birds who feed on the things that live in those forests, for instance, the woodpeckers. The rest of the bird groupings and feeding subfields are not in any foreseeable danger as a whole. Individually, these matters may differ, but overall, the rest are more generalized than the before-mentioned few, so consequently, more able to adapt to changing environments if need be. These includes a majority of the backyard birds, wading birds, and scavengers. While this data is somewhat conclusive now, the future vulnerability of these species is dependent on how they can adapt to global warming, the constantly developing world, and what we do to help them.